My brothers and sisters, what we witnessed today in New York wasn't just a speech. It was the moment the international community said enough to genocide. When Benjamin Netanyahu took that podium, delegates from dozens of nations, African, Asian, and even European countries, stood up and walked out in coordinated protest against what they called a war criminal. Also, Trump said, "I'll not allow it anymore." This wasn't spontaneous. The Palestinian Authority had spent a week organizing this walkout, sending letters to world leaders asking them to refuse to legitimize a man presiding over the systematic destruction of Gaza. And they listened. The room that should have been filled with 193 nation representatives became a near-empty theater, with Netanyahu delivering 45 minutes of genocidal justification to empty chairs. "You are fighting us," he declared, pointing his finger at empty seats. "You condemn us, you embargo us, you wage lawfare against us." The audacity, my friends, standing in a room that had just emptied because of his actions and calling them weak. He looked directly into those cameras broadcasting live into Gaza, where his bombs have been falling, and called Western leaders weak-kneed for recognizing Palestinian statehood. France, Britain, Australia, Canada, nations that have stood by Israel for decades. He called them appeasers of evil. But here's where this story becomes truly fascinating, my friends. Even as Netanyahu delivered this scorching rebuke to the world, he conspicuously avoided one topic that everyone expected him to address: annexation of the West Bank. His far-right coalition partners have been screaming for it. His base wants it. The moment seemed perfect for it. Yet, silence. Why? Because 3,000 miles away, Donald Trump had already drawn a red line. No annexation, not on his watch. And Netanyahu, for all his bluster, knows exactly who holds the real power in this relationship. The choreography of this moment is breathtaking. Picture Netanyahu, alone at that podium, cameras broadcasting his words live into Gaza. Yes, they played his speech on loudspeakers in the very place his bombs have been falling, while protesters gathered outside the UN building demanding sanctions against Israel. This wasn't just defiance. This was desperation dressed up as strength. A man who has spent his entire career reading the room, suddenly finding himself in a room that had literally emptied to avoid hearing him speak. And then, just as the echoes of his voice faded in that nearly empty hall, came the bombshell that changes everything. One line from Trump's camp to Reuters: "I think we may have a deal." 5 words that could end months of destruction. 5 words that could bring home the hostages Netanyahu claims to care about so much. 5 words that could stop the killing he says is necessary for Israel's survival. The timing isn't coincidental, my brothers and sisters. Nothing in this game ever is. Netanyahu flies to Washington on Monday for what may be the most crucial meeting of his political life. Trump, the master dealmaker, has apparently decided the show must end. The question is, will Netanyahu accept the terms, or will he choose to burn everything down rather than admit defeat? Let me tell you what's really happening here. This isn't about Hamas. This isn't about terrorism. This isn't even about hostages, though they matter immensely. This is about a man who has bet everything: his political survival, his country's international standing, his own freedom from prosecution, on a single catastrophic gamble. Netanyahu believed he could reshape the Middle East through sheer force. He believed he could eliminate Hamas, neutralize Hezbollah, force Iran to its knees, and emerge as the strongman who finally brought security to Israel. He believed the world would ultimately stand with him because, in his mind, Israel's fight is civilization's fight against barbarism. But empires aren't built on belief alone. They're built on reality. And the reality is this: Israel is more isolated today than it has been since its founding. The International Criminal Court wants Netanyahu arrested as a war criminal. His own military leadership is questioning the strategy. European allies are recognizing Palestinian statehood in direct response to his actions. Even American college campuses, the future leaders of the world's most powerful nation, are turning against Israel in unprecedented numbers. Yet here's what makes Netanyahu so dangerous in this moment. He has nothing left to lose. A man with nothing to lose is capable of anything. He's already facing potential arrest if he leaves Israel. His political coalition is fracturing. His own people are divided. The families of hostages are camping outside his home, demanding he bring their loved ones back alive. So when he stood in that UN hall today, speaking to empty seats, he wasn't really addressing the delegates who had walked out. He was talking to history. He was making his case to be remembered not as a war criminal, but as a leader who stood firm against impossible odds. "You are fighting us," he declared, his voice echoing in the chamber. "You condemn us, you embargo us, you wage political and legal warfare against us." But what he calls lawfare is simply international law being applied to war crimes. What he calls condemnation is the world refusing to be complicit in genocide. Let me be clear about what those empty seats represented. They represented the conscience of humanity. Every delegate who walked out was saying that Palestinian lives matter, that international law applies to everyone, that genocide cannot be rebranded as self-defense, no matter how eloquent the perpetrator. The Palestinian Authority's mission to the UN had organized this walkout with surgical precision. For a week, they sent letters to world leaders with one simple message: do not legitimize this war criminal with your presence. Do not let him use your attendance to normalize the systematic killing of Palestinian children. And the world responded, not just the usual suspects, the Arab and Muslim nations who have always stood with Palestine, but European delegations, African representatives, nations from across the global south who have watched the destruction of Gaza and said, this is not self-defense, this is extermination. Meanwhile, outside the UN building, thousands of protesters demanded not just condemnation, but action, real sanctions, economic consequences. The same international pressure that helped end apartheid in South Africa is now being demanded for apartheid Israel. But listen to what he didn't say, my friends. He didn't explain why over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. He didn't justify the bombing of hospitals, schools, and refugee camps. He didn't address why 70% of Gaza's infrastructure has been destroyed. He didn't explain why Palestinian children are being deliberately starved as a weapon of war. Instead, he offered only more of the same: indefinite genocide, indefinite occupation, indefinite resistance to Palestinian statehood. This is the language of ethnic cleansing, wrapped in the rhetoric of self-defense. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Just one day before Netanyahu's performance to empty chairs, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas received standing ovations in the same hall. The applause for Abbas versus the empty seats for Netanyahu tells you everything you need to know about where the world's conscience stands. This is the politics of genocide, taken to its logical extreme. Keep the world focused on Israeli victimhood while Palestinian bodies pile up. Keep talking about self-defense while systematically destroying an entire people. Keep invoking the Holocaust while committing acts that historians will study alongside the darkest chapters of human history. Consider the obscene theater of this moment. Netanyahu speaking about fighting terrorism while his words were broadcast live into Gaza, where Palestinian families huddled in the ruins of their homes could hear every justification for their ongoing slaughter. The oppressor explaining to his victims why their deaths are necessary for his security. But even master manipulators eventually run out of room to maneuver, and that room is shrinking rapidly. Consider the symbolism of this moment. Netanyahu speaking to an almost empty hall while his words were broadcast into Gaza, where the people living under his bombardment could hear every word. The hunter and the hunted, speaking past each other across an ocean of blood and grief. Meanwhile, outside the UN, protesters demanded sanctions, not just criticism, not just condemnation, but real economic consequences. The same sanctions that helped end apartheid in South Africa, the same sanctions that isolated regimes throughout history when diplomatic pressure failed. This is the arc of international justice, slow and imperfect, but ultimately inexorable. First comes criticism, then isolation, then consequences. Netanyahu is learning this lesson in real time. But Trump's intervention changes everything. One phone call from Mar-a-Lago carries more weight than 100 UN resolutions. One deal crafted in Washington can override months of international pressure. This is the reality of power in our world. It still flows through very few hands, and most of those hands belong to old men in expensive suits. The question now is whether Netanyahu will accept Trump's deal or continue down this path of isolation and confrontation. His speech today suggests a man who still believes he can win through sheer force of will. But will is not enough when the world has stopped listening. What we witnessed today was either the beginning of the end for Netanyahu or the moment he chose to burn everything down rather than admit defeat. History will judge which it was. But make no mistake, my brothers and sisters. The man who walked into that UN hall is not the same man who will fly to Washington on Monday. The world changed today. The room emptied, the applause died, and somewhere in the silence that followed, the sound of a political career, and perhaps a region, hanging by a thread. The curtain is falling, the stage is nearly empty, and Netanyahu stands alone under the harsh lights, delivering his lines to an audience that has already left the theater. But here's what the mainstream media won't tell you, my friends. This moment, this coordinated walkout, this mass rejection of genocide apologetics, represents the emergence of a new international consensus. A consensus that says Palestinian lives have equal worth, that international law applies to all nations, that historical trauma cannot be weaponized to justify present-day crimes. The delegates who walked out weren't just protesting Israel's actions in Gaza. They were rejecting the entire colonial framework that has allowed the systematic oppression of Palestinians for over 7 decades. They were saying that the age of Israeli impunity is over. This is why the Palestinian Authority's organizing strategy was so effective. They understood that sometimes the most powerful statement is silence. The silence of empty chairs, the silence of turned backs, the silence of a world that has finally heard enough justifications for the unjustifiable. Netanyahu represents the old colonial order, where European settler states could commit atrocities against indigenous populations and expect international support, or at least complicity, where historical victimhood could be used as a shield against accountability for present-day crimes, where a people could be slowly erased while the world looked the other way. But the world is no longer looking away. The walkout today proved that. Every empty seat was a vote for Palestinian dignity. Every turned back was a rejection of Israeli propaganda. Every delegate who refused to applaud was choosing truth over diplomatic politeness. Think about the courage this took. Many of these nations face enormous pressure from the United States, from Israel's lobbying apparatus, from economic and military partnerships that could be threatened. Yet they chose to stand with Palestine anyway. They chose moral clarity over political convenience. The contrast with Palestinian President Abbas's reception just one day earlier tells the entire story. Abbas received standing ovations for calling for Palestinian statehood, for demanding an end to occupation, for insisting that his people's rights be recognized. The same hall that emptied for Netanyahu filled with applause for the voice of Palestinian liberation. This is what a changing world order looks like, my brothers and sisters. Not dramatic overnight revolution, but the steady accumulation of moral pressure until the old justifications no longer work, until the old alliances no longer hold, until the cost of complicity becomes too high to bear. The Palestinian resistance, not just the armed resistance in Gaza, but the diplomatic resistance in New York, the cultural resistance on college campuses, the economic resistance through BDS campaigns, is finally breaking through decades of propaganda and manipulation. For too long, the Palestinian narrative has been marginalized, suppressed, twisted beyond recognition. Palestinian children were described as human shields when they died. Palestinian homes were called terrorist infrastructure when they were destroyed. Palestinian resistance was labeled terrorism, while Israeli violence was called self-defense. But truth has a way of emerging, especially when it's accompanied by thousands of hours of video evidence, by testimonies from international aid workers, by reports from Israeli soldiers themselves who can no longer stomach what they're being asked to do. The walkout today wasn't just about Gaza, though Gaza's suffering has been the catalyst. It was about recognizing that the Palestinian people have been telling the truth about their oppression for 76 years, and the world is finally ready to listen. Every delegate who walked out was acknowledging that Palestinian voices matter, that Palestinian children deserve the same protection as any other children, that Palestinian mothers have the same right to grieve as any other mothers, that Palestinian dreams of freedom are as legitimate as any other people's dreams of liberation. This is why Netanyahu looked so isolated up there, speaking to empty chairs, because he was isolated. The moral authority that Israel once claimed, the authority of the victim, the authority of the persecuted, the authority of the survivor, has been forfeited through the systematic persecution of another people. You cannot claim the legacy of those who suffered genocide while committing genocide against others. You cannot invoke the memory of the Holocaust while perpetrating acts that Holocaust survivors themselves condemn. You cannot call yourself a victim while running the world's largest open-air prison. The Palestinian Authority understood this perfectly when they organized today's walkout. They knew that the most powerful way to expose Israeli hypocrisy was simply to refuse to participate in it, to let Netanyahu speak his justifications to empty air, to let the world see what moral isolation actually looks like. Trump represents something else entirely: transactional power, pure, unadorned deal-making where sentiment has no place, and history is just another negotiating chip. Trump doesn't care about your grandfather's suffering or your people's ancient claims. He cares about results, ratings, and whether you're useful to him today, right now, in this moment. This is why Netanyahu's speech today was so revealing. Every word was calculated to appeal to the old system, invoking civilizational struggle, painting Israel as the lone defender against barbarism, appealing to Western guilt and fear. But he was speaking to an audience that has already moved beyond those appeals. The delegates who walked out weren't just protesting Israel's actions in Gaza. They were rejecting the entire framework that allowed those actions to continue unchallenged for so long. The framework that says some nations are above international law, that some suffering matters more than others, that some people's security justifies any amount of other people's death. Watch how this plays out over the next 72 hours, because I predict we're about to witness one of the most dramatic reversals in modern diplomatic history. Netanyahu will fly to Washington, believing he can still work his magic on Trump. He'll prepare his usual presentation, the maps, the intelligence briefings, the appeals to American interests and values. He'll remind Trump of evangelical voters and Jewish donors and the strategic importance of Israel in a hostile region. But here's what Netanyahu doesn't understand about Trump. The man who wrote The Art of the Deal has already decided the deal. Trump's comment about having a deal isn't a prediction, it's a declaration. The terms have been set. The only question is whether Netanyahu will accept them gracefully or be forced to accept them under pressure. Think about Trump's position here. He's facing a new term with global challenges that require actual solutions, not eternal conflicts. The Middle East war is consuming American attention and resources, while China expands its influence, while climate change reshapes global economics, while artificial intelligence transforms the nature of power itself. Trump doesn't want to be the president who presides over endless war in Gaza. He wants to be the president who solved what no one else could solve, the dealmaker who brought peace where others brought only violence. But peace requires concessions, real concessions, and Netanyahu has shown absolutely no willingness to make them. Today's speech proved that. 45 minutes of defiance and not one word about compromise. Not one gesture toward the families burying their children in Gaza. Not one acknowledgement that Israel's security cannot be built on other people's graves. This is where the mathematics of power become unavoidable. Israel cannot survive permanent international isolation. It cannot maintain technological and economic superiority while the world turns its back. It cannot expect American support, regardless of its actions, especially when those actions increasingly embarrass and complicate American interests. The walkout today wasn't just symbolic. It was a preview of Israel's future if Netanyahu continues on this path. Empty rooms, closed doors, isolated voices echoing in chambers that no longer listen. And Netanyahu knows this. You could see it in his eyes today, even as his voice remained strong. The slight tension around his mouth when he looked out at those empty seats. The way he gripped the podium when he talked about Israel fighting alone. This is a man who understands that his political survival and his country's future are diverging, possibly forever. But understanding and accepting are two different things entirely. Here's what I think happens next, and why this moment will be remembered as the turning point. Trump will present Netanyahu with a deal that's both generous and non-negotiable. Immediate ceasefire, hostage exchange, massive reconstruction aid for Gaza, international guarantees for Israel's security, and some form of Palestinian autonomy that stops short of full statehood but provides real governance and dignity. Netanyahu will resist. He'll invoke security concerns, political constraints, the impossibility of negotiating with terrorists. He'll remind Trump of shared interests and common enemies. And Trump will do something Netanyahu doesn't expect. He'll walk away. Not permanently, but long enough to let Netanyahu feel what isolation really means. Long enough for the families of hostages to understand that their prime minister is choosing political survival over their loved ones' lives. Long enough for the Israeli public to see their international standing evaporate in real time. Because that's how Trump operates. He doesn't threaten. He demonstrates consequences. He doesn't argue. He creates new realities and forces others to adapt to them. The tragedy in all this is how unnecessary it has become. The October 7th attacks created genuine sympathy for Israel worldwide. There was a moment when the international community would have supported strong Israeli action against Hamas. But Netanyahu chose maximalism over strategy, destruction over precision, permanent war over achievable victory. He turned a moment of global sympathy into global isolation. He transformed justified self-defense into what much of the world now sees as collective punishment and possible genocide. He took the moral high ground and systematically dynamited it until nothing remained but accusations and empty UN halls. And now he stands at the podium, alone, still believing that force of will can overcome mathematical reality, still thinking that the old rules apply in a world that has moved beyond them. Watch the footage again, my brothers and sisters. Watch Netanyahu's face as he delivers that speech. This is what political death looks like. Not defeat in battle, but irrelevance. Speaking passionate words to empty chairs. Making urgent appeals to people who have already stopped listening. And now, as Netanyahu flies to Washington, he carries with him the stench of international rejection. He goes not as a leader seeking support, but as a pariah hoping to avoid consequences. The man who once commanded standing ovations in Congress now struggles to fill a UN hall because the world has seen too much, knows too much, understands too clearly what he represents. The Palestinian people, meanwhile, have never been stronger on the world stage. Their cause has never been more supported. Their narrative has never been more widely accepted. The walkout today was proof that decades of steadfast resistance, of refusing to disappear, of insisting on their humanity, despite every attempt to dehumanize them, has finally paid off. This is what liberation looks like in practice, not just the eventual establishment of a Palestinian state, but the recognition by the international community that Palestinians are a people deserving of rights, dignity, and justice, that their suffering matters, that their resistance is legitimate, that their calls for freedom echo the greatest liberation movements in human history. The empty seats in the UN today were not just a rejection of Netanyahu, they were an embrace of Palestine. Every delegate who walked out was casting a vote for Palestinian liberation. Every empty chair was a space reserved for Palestinian dignity. Every moment of silence was a prayer for Palestinian freedom. Tomorrow's newspapers will focus on Netanyahu's defiance, on Trump's deal-making, on the political calculations of powerful men. But the real story is simpler and more profound. The world has chosen sides, and it has chosen Palestine. The curtain has fallen on Israeli impunity. The theater of occupation is closing, and in its place a new story is being written. The story of Palestinian liberation, Palestinian dignity, Palestinian victory over the forces that have tried for 76 years to erase them from existence. The walkout today wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. The beginning of the end of Israeli apartheid, the beginning of Palestinian freedom, the beginning of justice, finally, after decades of V.O.T.